Hello everyone, welcome to Psych 101 Lecture 3. We're going to talk about Sigmund Freud, the explorer of the depths, and the father of psychoanalysis. And the reason why we call Freud the explorer of the depths is he kind of discovered, well not really discovered, but he brought into being what we know as depth psychology, which is an exploration of the unconscious. And when we discuss the unconscious, you'll kind of get a good sense of why we say he was the explorer of the depths on that one. So without further ado, let's get into Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud lived between 1856 and 1939. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what used to be known as Moravia and the town of Freiburg. His father was a merchant and had been married once before. It's not clear whether his father had divorced that lady or if she had died. But when Sigmund was 4, they moved to Vienna, Austria, where Freud would grow up and go into school, complete his medical studies, and get his MD, which is his medical doctor, in 1881. Freud of course, was into hypnotherapy and stuff at the time. And so he came across this one lady by the name of Miss Pappenheim. So what Freud would do with hypnosis and hypnotherapy was treat patients with hysteria, which is what we call somatization disorders, kind of like hypochondria, for example, or a pain disorder. It's they're strange disorders that aren't specified that mimic symptoms kind of like physical ailments, but there's no actual known biological cause. Now, he had a friend who was a successful physician, and his name is Joseph Breuer. And Breuer had this patient who was an intelligent and attractive Jewish lady, and her name was Bertha Pappenheim, and she was like many of the wealthy Victorian women, was pampered, overprotected, and so when her father fell ill, during his illness, and then she nursed him. She was taking care of, make sure he ate, make sure he bathed, all of the things that go along with that up until he died. After his death, she started to show symptoms of hysteria, which is what they call it. So there was muscle spasms, paralysis of the right arm, as well as reported loss of appetite. She also began to hallucinate these visions of like black snakes and skeletons. And so Freud began to treat her hypnosis, and so he would get her to use words to start pointing to points. He was letting her talk and jumping on words to start as starting points so that he could help her produce the images in her mind. So he would talk about the snakes and the skeletons and stuff like that. And this was Breuer that did this. And so this method would temporarily free her from her symptoms for many hours, but unfortunately by like the next day they would relapse back into active symptoms. And she had not been cured through the catharsis, which is the emotional release of what was known as the talking cure at the time. In fact, Pappenheim spent much time in a sanitarium where she would eventually recover. And after her recovery, she went on to be a successful house mother in an orphanage and led a campaign to protect endangered girls. And there's no record of any Mr. Pappenheim or marriage. She never had any children either. So then Freud's private practice. So he first began treating hysterical patients in his own private practice, which was probably held in an office in his own house. Now, at the time, electrotherapy was used as a means to give shocks into the paralyzed area to kind of jumpstart the nerves, and that would make your arm move through voluntary skeletal movements. And along with this, he would use the hypnotic suggestion to treat his patients, and using hypnotism wasn't exactly applauded by the other physicians in Vienna. Call back to the previous lecture when we talked about Mesmer and his strange theories using mesmerism and hypnotism and whatnot. Now, psychoanalysis kind of started off from hypnosis in a sense. There's no historical or sociological account of any scientific progress that can sufficiently explain the sudden appearance of psychoanalysis, but it's generally accepted that it happened by accident, as well as a stroke of genius on Freud's part. So, how did psychoanalysis begin, you might ask? Well, it kind of manifested itself in response to a case to a demand by a baroness by the name of Fanny Mosher. She was a 40-year-old widow suffering from facial tics, hallucinations of snakes and dead rats, had these nightmares involving vultures, and she also had this crippling fear of strangers and the fear of socializing with strangers. And so from his interaction with Miss Moser, he learned something, that when he asked her to recall her traumatic event that initiated her symptoms, she would just ramble incoherently about who knows what kind of nonsense. And then one day during treatment, she grudgingly said how she did not know what the event was that was causing this stuff, and she just wanted to be listened to. Just hear what I have to say, kind of thing. And so Freud kind of meditated on that for a minute and just let her talk on as she wished. Just let her ramble. And as tedious and wearisome as it can be to listen to somebody just ramble on incoherently, he let her say whatever just came to her mind and realized that this was a more effective way to get into the unconscious hidden memories. So those hidden memories in the unconscious, that's kind of like deep within your unconscious. And so that's where this idea of the exploration of the depths comes from, is from and depth psychology is for probing into those unknown depths of the unconscious. And so this led him to what was known as free association, and that's where Freud began inviting patients to just lay on his couch and just say whatever came to mind. Sometimes he would throw out some like hook words out there. It's like, well, I'm going to say this, you tell me the first word that comes to your mind, and just let you keep going. And so that's how that's kind of psychoanalysis kind of came into it. And then because of psychoanalysis and that probing of the unconscious, you get this idea that Freud kind of helped bring into being. Hence, he's the father of dynamic psychology. And so Freud's theories of the unconscious were purely psychological terms that would profoundly affect our Western culture. So Freud began as a strict adherent to the mechanist physiology school of psychology. It wasn't until he gave that up that he started really making his discoveries. And so one of those discoveries is the dynamic unconscious. So most psychologists describe the unconscious as like this repository for memories regarding your experiences, the information you store for recall and use. And so Freud labeled it like an inert but accessible area of mental life. And it's like the preconscious. And it was distinct from the unconscious. So you have the conscious mind, you have the preconscious, and then you have this big, massive storage area known as the unconscious. And he had this idea that the mind had these three levels. You have the conscious, the preconscious, the unconscious, and it's the unconscious that's the most influential and highly active, powerful source of all of our drives, our forbidden wishes that generate pressures on the conscious mind, and that determines much of our behavior. And so you can kind of almost conceptualize the mind as this this like iceberg. As you can see here in the slide, you have the conscious mind up above, and there's not much of it. I mean, there's a bit, but there's not much. But underneath the water is the unconscious mind in that iceberg. It's kind of interesting, and the reason why I chose this slide is, and we'll get into Carl Jung in the future, but Jung thought of the water as a symbolism of reflecting the unconscious. The unconscious is like water, so anything hidden below the water is the unconscious. So Jung thought of water symbolizing the unconscious. So anytime you dream of swimming in a lake or a pool, or anytime that there's water involved in a dream, he thought of that as the symbolic representation of the unconscious. But enough of Jung right now, because we have to talk about Jung to really understand Jung's theories. But going back to Freud's concept of the unconscious, especially in dynamic psychology, you have the primary and secondary processes. The primary is your urges and learning what is acceptable and unacceptable within like your own social, societal surround. Then you have your secondary processes, which is your thinking, your knowing, and your problem solving. So that's your more complex processes. And there are ways to conceive and carrying out your desires in what's considered socially acceptable. So there's this primary and secondary process kind of working together, such as, you know, your urges, learning what's acceptable and how to act them out in the world in a way that's not going to cause you any misery, suffering, or problem. And then we get into the Oedipus complex and repression. So if anybody out here that on YouTube is listening to any of Jordan Peterson's lectures where he talks about the Oedipal mother, that's the I'm going to eat you, devour you, protect you from anything on the outside world, and therefore I'm going to protect you at the cost of you. Well, Freud's idea of the Oedipal complex is a bit different from Jung. So according to Freud, he believed that sexual drive was the most powerful force in the development from childhood to adulthood. And so much so that it played a role in the development of the normal and neurotic personalities. And I plan on designing a personality course, so don't worry, we'll get into that there. So, but he thought that, you know, sexual, you know, drive and sexuality was what helped develop the human personality. So you would have the normal functioning, everything is socially acceptable type of personality, and then you would have the neurotic personality that's maladaptive and dysregulated and going to cause you trouble. And so he called the Oedipal complex because it was the young child having sexual feelings toward a parent of the opposite sex. And so where anxiety and neurosis would come from would be the repression of those unwanted, unacceptable desires toward that. So the repression came from hiding that away in the unconscious, and this would, of course, become a core theory for child development for Freud at the time. And so for the next several years, Freud would analyze the dreams of some of his patients in his own dreams, and it's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it. I've got a copy of it. I thought about incorporating it into the lecture, but you know, I don't know if I could hold your attention for like, you know, an hour and a half just to go through the interpretation of dreams, but he goes through like his dream symbolism, what that means, and that's objects like hallways, doorways, and things like that are supposed to symbolize the female reproductive organs, and anything that would be phallic in essence was supposed to be a symbolic representation of the male reproductive organs. And so in 1900, at the age of 44, he completed his self-analysis of his dreams, and so he published his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. Like I said, it's a dry read, it's difficult to read, but I highly, if anybody's interested in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, this is a good book to get you kind of, give you a good foundation on what was and how everything that we have now has kind of, I would say, grown from and springboarded from it. So it's very fascinating, good book. However, at first it wasn't a good seller. The reviews were not even stellar at all. In fact, a lot of people thought it was quackery. And during the 2 years during this, his friendships with his colleagues had began to dissolve. Brewer, who we previously mentioned, was definitely one of those friendships that would kind of dissipate and fall apart. But not to worry, you know, Freud would make more friends and do more for psychology. But his friendship with Brewer and another physician ended up souring to the point that it just was no longer able to be sustained. And so that brings us to the founding of the International Psychoanalytic Society, and this was in 1902. So this was 2 years after the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams. And so this is when Freud became a professor extraordinarius of the University of Vienna. Also this same year, Freud, along with another physician that he came to meet, Wilhelm Steckel, and he actually treated this physician for impotence, which is kind of ironic because given his whole nature on thinking of sexuality as the main driving force and what constitutes the foundation of personality and everything else. They formed the Wednesday Psychological Society. So they would meet up every Wednesday and they would swap theories. They would talk about publications they were working on. And so it was really a good meeting of the minds. And of course, this group would grow to include other psychologists and psychoanalysts such as Otto Rank, Alfred Adler. Adler was known to look at the position of birth as one of the driving forces on personality formulation in adult children and adolescents. So let's say, for example, you have a family, there's 3 kids that are born. You would have the middle child, or even the youngest child, let's say, would they'd have an inferiority complex because of their position at birth, and that inferiority complex would bring forth this what would you say? It would bring on its own neurosis and its own hint of psychological problems. And so Adler's very famous for that. And you had Sandor Ferenczi and Ernest Jones, and they all went on to become very important psychoanalysts in their own right. And I hope to do lectures on them so that we can kind of get a better grasp of just how important is psychological society and what would become the Psychoanalytic Society, and how influential it was in psychology, psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis, because of all of them were very, very important in the history of psychology. This group became the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and it would grow and grow and grow as more people kind of joined into this thing. To by 1910, so in 8 years at a congress in Nuremberg, Germany, the International Psychoanalytic Society would be founded. And of course, 3 years later, he was invited, this is Freud, to give 5 lectures in Worcester, Massachusetts, accompanied by 2 colleagues in the International Psychoanalytic Society, and that would, of course, be Sandor Ferenczi, which went on to be an important psychoanalyst, and then, of course, Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is one of my favorite psychoanalysts. I've read more of his work than, say, Freud, so I consider myself more of a Jungian than a Freudian when it comes to the old schools of psychology, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, and all of that. And so his professional relationships with his colleagues would start to sour again once he returned, because Freud became so deeply embroiled in the politics of the psychoanalytic movement that he founded, of all things. So, of course, he was very protective of the roots that he cultivated when he grew this tree, let's say, where all these different psychoanalysts would branch out from this tree and kind of form their own branches and limbs and all of this, but he was at the very root of the thing. And so Breuer and Freud's relationship ended in bitterness over differences of opinion, and that's really terrible, because it's kind of funny. There's an old quote from Freud's wife, actually said, Siggy, for somebody who spends their time listening to other people and helping patients, you really just don't understand other people. And it's just funny because that caught Sigmund completely off guard. He listened to all these patients, he helped treat them, helped cure some of their mental illnesses or disorders, or their neurosis, as it was called, and yet was told that he didn't understand people. And so he was pushing away his friends like Breuer and Jung and Adler and all these other psychoanalysts. And who knows what kind of contributions they could have made if they all kind of kept their professional friendships together. But history being what it is, because they branched off, we have all these different branches of psychology as a discipline, different theories regarding treatment of different mental illnesses and disorders. So it's sad the way things happened, but in the same sense, this is why we have the diversity of thought within the field of psychology. So then you get, and we're going to talk about that now with the split of the psychoanalyst. So Alfred Adler, as I talked about before, came to believe that the position of birth and parenting styles had impacts on child development, which leads to their personality and inferiority complexes, which resulted in the behavioral compensation based upon your position of birth, because everyone thinks that the firstborn is the most entitled. The secondborn is also kind of favored as the baby, and so like the middle kid kind of gets left out because the oldest is, the gold standard, and then you have everyone loves the baby, and so the middle kid kind of just gets tucked away to the side, unwantingly or unwillingly, or unconsciously, I guess is a better way of putting it. And because of this, Adler became very critical of Freud's theory on the role of sexuality in character development. So Adler split from Freud, and he resigned from the Vienna Society, and he founded one on his own. And that was with him and a group of his own followers. Now, Carl Jung, on the other hand, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, he disagreed with Freud on not just the sexual origin of neurosis, but he believed they were a current maladjustment, not so much a past trauma, but a current trauma or maladjustment. And so you have disorders that would stem from childhood trauma, but he also wanted to look at what was going on currently. He also held these religious and almost what they would call mystical convictions, because Freud was he was more of an atheist type. So he criticized Jung's ideas on religion and mysticism. Jung wrote this book called Alchemy and Psychology. It's very fascinating. I highly recommend it. And he also had his beliefs in collective unconscious and archetypes. And you might say, well, what the hell is a collective unconscious, or what the hell is an archetype? Well, the collective unconscious is this idea that all human beings share this unconscious mind, and therefore the different archetypes, like the hero myths and all of the religions, they all have the hero myths, and it's all shared, and it transcends different cultures, different peoples, different countries. And so this all of this shared unconscious is what is what gave birth to these old ideas that are so old that they're innate. We don't have to learn them. We just know what they are. It's kind of like why there's the European medieval dragon and there's the Chinese interpretation of the dragon, but they're both serpents and they both represent chaos. So that's the archetypical theme that's between two completely different cultures and people backgrounds. But that's just part of it. I mean, the idea of the archetypes are just complicated. So when we get to Carl Jung, I'm going to go through all of that. But these contentions caused Jung to also break away from Freud in 1914. So he formed his own analytical psychology movement. In fact, that's what it was called, was analytical psychology, which we'll talk about when we get to Carl Jung. Otto Rank was also a very close, loyal friend and follower, and he produced his own theory. And when it came to neurosis, and believed that anxiety was caused by birth trauma, and that male sexual urges were just this unconscious desire to re-enter the womb, because they believed that the children, when they were birthed violently from the womb. And Freud's attempts to try to reconcile that viewpoint, it ended in failure, and Rank ended the friendship and working relationship with Freud in 1926. So some other stuff kind of going on about that time too, because that's roughly after Germany lost World War I. And so you start to kind of, here in a couple of years, you'll start to see this uprising in Germany that took place that was very, very, at the time would was probably considered very frightening, especially from Jung's perspective when we talk about the shadow and the archetypes of the shadow when we get into the section on Jung, the collective unconscious, and archetypes. Now, when it comes to personality, Freud looked at personality as this three-tiered structure. You had the id, which stands for inner desire. That's the I want to do that now. So that's all of your impulses. You have the superego, which is the outside societal norms that says, well, you can't do that, or it's not right to do that. And then you have the ego, which is like in the middle between your inner desires and what's acceptable on the outside in society, saying, perhaps unconsciously we can compromise and we can come to some sort of agreement and consensus, and then we can kind of move forward with that. So that's kind of how that works with personality. So let's talk about the id. Like I said, the impulse, the I want to do that now. Well, according to Freud, the id is present at birth. It's the reservoir of the unconscious motivations to avoid pain and obtain pleasure. And it's the impulses of that. It's like life and death as he conceptualized it. For life was libido, sexual energy, because you have sexual relations to bring forth life. That's how reproduction works. And death was the aggressive instinct. That was your fight. That was the, fight to the death kind of thing. And so the id was thought to manifest itself in reflex actions, physical symptoms, uncensored mental images, and unbidden thoughts. So everything that you repress down that's not socially acceptable, that's the id. So you can think of the id as kind of like that pushed down wild aspect of, you can conceptualize that as the archetypal caveman. So that's kind of what the id is representative of. And then you have the ego. And the ego is conceptualized as a referee between the id and the wants of society. It buckles under the pressure that life reality puts upon it. It's like you have a sexual desire. And, the id was like, well, we want to do that now. And, of course, society says, well, there's certain rules to courtship that you kind of have to go through so that way you can have what you want, but you have to follow these steps. And so the ego mitigates those steps and says, okay, this is how this goes. And so the ego reins in the tendencies of the id until socially acceptable outlets are made available. Here's a good, perfect example. You have an aggressive type personality, let's say. That's all of your aggression, smash, destroy impulses. Well, you can't just go out, smash, and destroy stuff, obviously. You can't do that. It's not socially acceptable, but what you can do, and you find this among heavy metal musicians, loud, roaring guitar riffs, scary imagery, aggressive lyrics, and it's socially acceptable. It's an outlet for that aggression, and it's a representation of reason and good sense that is both conscious and unconscious. So you get all these unconscious aggressive thoughts out, but you do it in a socially acceptable way, which is playing in a hard rock heavy metal band and playing in a gig, and eventually, if you do well enough, you might be somewhat successful at it. So that's kind of a good understanding of the ego. Then you have the superego. That's the third aspect of personality to develop and represent morality. And morality, as Freud defined it, was the rules of parents and society at large. This is, the rules of the household that your parents made you grow up with. Like, for example, I wasn't allowed to hang out after dark. I'd have to be in the yard or at the house, or my buddies would have to come over, hang out at the house. I couldn't just go run wild through the neighborhood after dark. So that was a rule. And so that was something that I abided by. So my superego would always remind me, hey, you can't be out running around at dark. You got to get in the yard or you're going to be in some trouble, and you don't want to get grounded and all of that nonsense. And so that's kind of how that kind of works. And you can almost, and that's the realm of conscience. And so that's kind of that inner voice that tells you, like when you've done something wrong, and we discussed the daemon of Socrates. in lecture 1. That's that little voice inside your head that tells you, well, you shouldn't do this and you know better, or you shouldn't say that because you don't honestly believe it, or wait a minute, is that your idea? Are you sure that's your idea? Because if it's not your idea, then you shouldn't be passing it off as your own idea. That kind of thing. It's that little, it's your conscience is basically what makes sure that you speak and act truthfully. And so the superego is partly conscious because you have to remember those rules, but it's mostly unconscious. And it deals out positive emotion when you do something well. And so if you achieve something, you're going to feel good about yourself. But if you do something wrong and you know it, you're going to feel that guilt and shame. And you do that when you do something that violates your conscience. And so you don't want to do that. And so the superego is what mitigates society's rules at large. And it's what the ego is what mitigates the rules of society at large and your inner desires. Your ego is the one that says, okay, well, we're going to have to make a compromise here so that way we can live properly. And so that's also important to know. And then you also have defense mechanisms. So we're going to talk about two Freuds here. So you have Sigmund Freud, who thought that anxiety arose from the conflict between the id and the superego, and so to combat this, there were these unconscious defense mechanisms in place that would keep a person functioning normally. Now, Freud's daughter Anna, she grew up to be a psychologist and a psychoanalyst herself, and outlined 8 different defense mechanisms that protected a person from anxiety disorders. And of course, they were called repression, projection, reaction, formation, regression, denial, displacement. That's 6. Kind of hard to see. You have acting out, and then you have humor. I hope you could hear all that. So the 8 of them: repression, projection, reaction, formation, regression, denial, displacement, acting out, and humor. And I'm sure we've all done one or more of these types of things in any uncomfortable situation. So let's talk at length. So you have repression. This is when a threatening idea, a memory, or an emotion, you block it from your consciousness. And so an example is like when a woman has a frightening experience in early childhood, but she can't remember it. And so it's stored in the unconscious, so she's unaware of it. So there's like a bit of memory that's lost and blocked out, and it's like a blacking out. It's like a redaction in a document. So you think of your memories in the unconscious as a document, and some of your memories, if you've repressed them, they're going to have these black lines through stuff that you're not going to remember. So it's kind of like redacting it in a sense. And then projection. We've all been guilty of this, and that's when you have an unwanted or threatening feeling that not only do you repress it, but you attribute it to someone else. So one form of this is the scapegoat. And that's where a powerless person or group of people is blamed by individuals or a group who are insecure and feel threatened. And going back to when I said, 1926, there were some uprisings starting to happen in Germany, some really bad situations starting to arise, what would go on to become the Nazification of World War II Germany. And that's what the Nazis did with the Jews before and during World War II, is they projected their own resentment, their bitterness, their malevolence. They projected that onto the Jewish people as a means of, well, the Jews are the reason we lost World War I. They're the reason why our economy is shattered, and so they became the scapegoat for that. And it cost 6 million Jewish people their lives ultimately. At Auschwitz and the death camps. And so that's what was really starting to worry Freud too in Austria, right as Nazi Germany and Hitler came to power. So you have reaction formation. That's another defense mechanism. And this occurs when a feeling that produces an unconscious anxiety is transformed into the opposite in the consciousness, in the unconscious mind. And so you could have a woman who will not admit that she fears her husband, and let's say he just beats the crap out of her. She's afraid of him. She's disgusted by him because of his behavior. However, she will consciously cling on to a belief that she loves him deeply and will be over the top in her vehemence of that thought. Such if you say, well, your husband beats the crap out of you, you should probably leave. And she'd be like, oh, no, he's a good guy. I love him. I'm not going to leave him. Yeah, let's see how that bloody well works out for you. But that's kind of what we're talking about, is if you, like I said, if you know somebody who's a victim of domestic violence and you try to bring that to the forefront, and so not only do they deny it and repress it, but they'll over the toply say, well, no, I actually really love my husband, and and will justify the bad behavior. And that's honestly, I think that's one of the reasons why domestic violence is so terrible and such a horrible thing that happens to women, and why they can't leave is because of this reaction formation to it. Now, I could be wrong. That's just a hypothesis, and it would have to be tested. But that's just one example of that reaction formation. And, of course, regression. And that's when a person will regress to a previous stage of psychological development. And one example is if you have a child, say from the age of 6 or 7, stuck in an abusive home situation, they may revert to thumb sucking. And because of that, there's adults. I work at a psychiatric facility where there's a 30-some-odd-old person who still sucks his thumb because that's a comfort. So that's a regression. And adults do it too. And one example is an adult who reverts to immature behavior such as childish temper tantrums. We all hear of the Peter Pan complex, the boy who won't grow up. When you have somebody in their 20s or their 30s and they still act like they're a teenager, like, that's a regression or stunted psychological growth. And it's a problem. And I see it in my professional life every day. And so it's not, these aren't just like concepts thrown out there. There are situations where you see these and they have merit. And then you have denial. This is where people flat out refuse to face the unpleasant realities in their life. It's like refusing to admit one drinks too much alcohol. And it's a protection of the self-image. That's, as Jung called you have the persona. That's the mask. That's the that's the me I want you to see. And so I have this persona that, is a moderate drinker, doesn't, 1 or 2 and we're fine. But the truth is you're not having 1 or 2 and you're fine. You're having 7 or 8 and you're a falling down drunken mess. And so you flat out deny that. So that's denial. That's the denial defense mechanism. And then you have displacement. And that's when people will direct their emotions at a person or other target instead of the real object of their feelings. So think of the young boy who's angry at his father. But he's also afraid of confronting him. So what does he do? He takes the anger out on his siblings or his toys or the family dog. And so Freud believed that this displacement, and this is going back to Sigmund, believed that displacement served a higher cultural social purpose and was called sublimation. And aggression could be sublimated into competitive sports, roughly speaking. So like you have this anger at somebody else, and so it's like, well, I'm really angry at this person, so I'm going to take that anger out on the football field, and then the next person I tackle, that's who I'm going to tackle. So I'm going to displace my anger at person A, and I'm going to use it to tackle person B on the football field. And so you could say that's a healthy adaptation to it, but the unhealthy is, of course, when you start abusing like your siblings or your family pet because you're angry at someone else. That's pathological, it's maladaptive, and it's not good behavior. And so that's how displacement works. And then you have acting out. These are impulsive actions that people fail to consider the consequences of. And, there's like if you're lonely and you just want attention, so you might be disruptive and act out disruptively because, well, any attention's better than no attention at all, even if it's negative attention. And who the hell wants negative attention? So, that's something to be very cognizant of. And then there's humor. And I think we've all used humor as a defense mechanism in an uncomfortable social situation. The most common and normal defense mechanism is humor. It acts as a shield from fear or anxiety, inducing things such as death, sexual desire, sexual performance, and aggression. That's why there's so many jokes by comedians surrounding these themes. Perfect example is we all know online, we've heard of this cancel culture where you can't say anything, and it causes a real anxiety about what you can and cannot say, or else, heaven forbid, the online Twitter mob comes after you, and the social justice warrior types will just not relent. And so you have Dave Chappelle, who used humor to shield himself from that type of anxiety of saying, it's like, look at me, I go around, digging up people's past things that they've said and try to get them removed from online, and who am I? And everybody, might point out one or two person, and he just looked at the audience. It's all of you. And so that's one way humor is used to act as a shield for that. And Chappelle got a lot of flack for it, and he stood his ground, stood firm in his convictions, which is very admirable. But even in some situations where you're just uncomfortable socially, using a joke or two to try to release the tension. So that's one way of negative emotion regulation, is using humor to crack a joke and to not let your anxiety and your fears kind of take hold of you, because you don't want to do that. And so to close up defense mechanisms, and this is not sure if this was Anna or Sigmund, but they thought of the defense mechanisms as a means to protect the ego from anxiety that could result from the tragedies of life. And people differ at the individual level on what mechanisms they use and how rigid and how flexible they are. And as we discussed, there's healthy and unhealthy mechanisms that were said to cause psychological neurosis. They were unhealthy, maladaptive, and that's like sublimation, where instead of using it in a positive way of channeling your aggression or your anger, you were channeling it in a way that was detrimental to yourself, detrimental to others, and possibly caused you some problems. And so that's not good, obviously. And so then we get into Freud's latter years. And so we can we'll probably end up wrapping it up here, but in 1923, Freud contracted oral cancer at 67, and this is because he smoked cigars every day. He had a terrible cigar habit. And I think it was something to the effect of 3 a day, but it could be upward as much as 5 a day. And he had several operations over the next 16 years to remove cancerous tissue from the upper part of his mouth. I think it's called the palate, right in there. And he ended up having to wear a prosthetic denture to separate his mouth from his nasal cavity, which would make eating and talking very difficult, and it was very painful. And of course, the denture, the prosthetic piece would have to be removed for regular cleaning, which was also reported to be extremely painful and very difficult. But in his final years, like I said, the Nazi uprising in Germany, because Freud was of Jewish descent, the Nazis were taking his books and burning it, calling it Jewish filth. And so this made Freud very, very afraid. And they almost didn't want to let him go, but it took Roosevelt up to 1938 to be able to get Freud out of Austria, and that was right before Austria fell to the annexation, or Anschluss as they called it, when Germany overtook Austria. Even though they did it without firing a single shot, it was still not good for anybody that was of Jewish descent and living in Austria when Germany overtook and conquered Austria. So in 1939, a year later, after I think it was 3 weeks after the outbreak of World War II, Freud died in 1939 there. And so Freud was one of the most important figures in psychology, because it wasn't he abandoned that whole mechanist physiology, the mechanical physiological aspects of psychology, of how the brain works and the mind works in conjunction with the body. He was really concerned with the depths of the unconscious. And so because of Freud, we have psychoanalysis, we have psychotherapy. We were able to help people be able to identify thoughts that cause negative emotion, which causes negative behavioral outcomes because of those emotions. And so I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. References, of course, is the Hunt book, The Story of Psychology, and of course that other textbook, The Psychology in Perspective, 3rd edition. And like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture that I presented to you today. Coming back, I will talk more about like Carl Jung, because I think it's very important that we talk about the two, what I would say are the two paramount fundamental psychologists in psychology, being Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. So the next lecture will be on Carl Jung. You guys have a wonderful day. If you're listening to this via the podcast, hopefully I have some more episodes up soon. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I hope to get the Jung lecture up in a more timely manner than this lecture went up. But thank you guys for your attention. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I made it somewhat interesting.